Hi everyone, this is Jade. I'm about to post the audio for a podcast I was on. The podcast is called Electric Circus and is run by a guy named Carter Lawson, who reached out as a fan of what I do here. We had a pretty open-ended discussion about the indie web, art and creativity in our current age, and general reflections on the intersection of internet and culture today. I thought it was an interesting talk and wanted to upload it on my channel, so I hope you enjoy listening to it. Carter also gave me an advance warning that his voice might be a little lower than mine in the mixing, so apologies in advance for that, but personally, I checked it out and I think it sounded fine. But anyway, the rest of the audio will be his, and the last thing I'll say is if you enjoyed what you heard, I recommend checking out the other episodes of his podcast, which I've linked in the description. Thank you, and I'll see you again soon.
Jade, how's it going? Welcome to the Electric Circus. It's great to have you on.
Great to be here, and this is the first time I've been invited on a podcast, so no one else can say that. So you have the honor.
Exclusive. I love it.
Yeah.
No, I've been a huge fan of your channel for about a year now. I think it was last spring. I had a several-hour drive, and I put on your Wittgenstein Explained video from a couple years ago. And that was my first exposure to Wittgenstein beyond just passing mentions of his name. And that was a real mind-blower, listening to that through with in one sitting. So I really appreciate the rigor and work you bring into your content. I wanted to ask, what is kind of your background in philosophy, and how did that bring you to doing content creation?
Sure. Well, thanks for the kind words, first of all. Pretty much seems like 90% of people discover my channel from that video. So it's just a video that got kind of blessed by the algorithm randomly, and I was just kind of gifted a big swell, and everyone seems to like it. So my background, I've talked a bit about this on my channel, but a lot of people assume, did you get a philosophy degree? Did you study philosophy? I didn't. My major was in history, and so I have always really enjoyed looking at history, but I enjoy philosophy. I've always had a very kind of contemplative personality and been interested in these big questions. So kind of before I knew philosophy as a field, I had a lot of philosophical ideas. I've always been really into art, and I've always been attracted to ideas like, what is beauty? What is art? And trying to answer those questions and nail them down for myself, successfully or not, is something I've been doing for as long as I can remember. So philosophy as a field was attractive to me through that. And then after I graduated, I took some philosophy courses, really enjoyed them, mostly about Buddhism and Indian religions was kind of where I got into it more than Western philosophy. But I mentioned this in the video, but I played, I'm a big I've always had a big interest in Japanese subcultures and anime and gaming and stuff like that. And there's a game that references Wittgenstein called Subarashi Kihibi, and I got interested in Wittgenstein because of that. And then several years it took me to kind of do all the research on the Tractatus, but it was that. And I had it for myself. Whenever you research a text like this, a lot of the times you research it and you get it, and then you lose it if you don't kind of practice and write it down. So I wrote down just kind of a summary for myself, and then I figured I'd make that into a video and release it, and other people seem to like it, so I've done that with some more since then.
That's cool. You had mentioned kind of anime. I'm sure it was like a JRPG being the pipeline kind of to philosophy, to like the Western canon. And I'm sure to a lot of older generations that would sound funny or like a kind of a weird way to come about it. But I see that a lot among many people in your audience, many people in mine. And I wanted to ask you, where do you think the quote unquote new ideas, intellectually stimulating art and media, where do you think that's coming from? Because I'm a big believer that people will say, oh, literature, music, film has declined the past couple of decades in the West, and I think there's a lot of merit to that. I'm a big believer in that. But then if you look at Asian cultures, if you look at gaming specifically, it's like, well, you can't say that. I mean, gaming where things were with Super Mario to Breath of the Wild. I mean, that's just a few short decades. Same with, anime has brought in so many anime, so interesting dramas, unique
Yep.
storytelling, psychology, philosophy, so many things that Western media just hasn't touched, or at least hasn't touched in the past few decades in pop culture. So, to you, where do you find things that you go, okay, there are new ideas here. This says something about our times
Yeah.
that other things aren't.
Yeah, it's interesting the way you put that because uh I do agree with that, but I also think sometimes when we intellectualize these things, it doesn't look as somber or serious as that might imply. And let me explain what I mean by that. Yeah. So I think about this a lot because I used to be really into movies. I still am, but kind of in high school, that's all I did was watch old movies. And it's really interesting watching movies made at like when film was a new medium, like around the early 1900s, because whether justified or not, there's just a sense of real freshness and like you can do anything, and people are just kind of throwing stuff at the wall, seeing what sticks. And like, here's a movie, and these are made by big companies, like sponsored by Edison's laboratory and stuff, so they're not like home movies. But even then, people are like, we can film for like 50 seconds. Let's film this factory. Let's try to tell the story of Rip Van Winkle or something like that. And then film kind of becomes, and at that time in the early 1900s, that's already when stuff like poetry and literature and the novel is being so deconstructed and being so like you have to think so hard of how to do new stuff in there. But film is seen is just this kind of open space where people are doing whatever and the rules aren't really there yet, and there's not a huge canon to speak in opposition to, of like, what's your take on this ancient medium. But now, like by the 80s, there's film has become so modern and played out that you do see that. But then video games emerge, and it's kind of where everyone's just throwing stuff out randomly and seeing what sticks. And anime is too. And nowadays, I think, gaming is kind of reaching that. Maybe I don't know what the next medium is going to be, if it's going to be streaming or VR experiences or something like that. But I think that cycle happens a lot. And so that's why I always I've always been interested in, seeing where things are happening in a way that's really unpretentious and kind of people are just doing whatever they want and feeling really uninhibited. It happens a lot in subcultural spaces. It's why I've always been really into heavy metal and punk and music genres that are intentionally almost repulsive to outsiders. Uh, and I always liked, anime and manga when it felt a little punk, felt a little like weird and outsider stuff, like for creepy, weird guys, or uh, where you were kind of embarrassed to tell people you were into it. I feel like that creates I guess what it creates is a lot of authenticity. It creates a feeling that if you're not doing it because it's cool, you have to really be doing it because you really have something to say. It's kind of how I feel about it.
That's a really interesting idea. Yeah, I always joke that if you want to know what's going to become mainstream, look at what's nerdy and give it a
Yeah,
decade or two. Like
for
like
sure.
Lord of the Rings, I'm sure, that was
Yeah,
considered pure nerd. And then
yeah.
Game of Thrones. Okay, well now dragons and medieval is cool, and now
There you go.
fantasy's like the best-selling mainstream genre.
There you go.
Same thing with superheroes. Comics are
Hmm.
ridiculous, and then wow, now there's superhero movies.
Yeah,
It goes anime is another
Dungeons and
one.
Dragons, stuff like that.
Yes, yes, Stranger Things. What that did for that.
Yeah,
Anime is another one. When I was in middle school, anime was like you don't tell people you
yeah,
watch anime. That's really
for
weird.
sure.
And now rappers, it's on their album covers. Everyone's
Yeah,
talking about Attack on Titan, Jujutsu
yeah,
Kaisen.
that's
People
right.
watch it
So
in
you were,
class and get no
yeah,
ridicule.
yeah, yeah. So you were still in that era where it was a little embarrassing, and probably depends
Yeah,
on where you are in the country and all that too, of course. But yeah, I think that's going to be a big cultural divide between my generation and later ones. But you still caught the tail end of that, it seems.
yeah. It is also interesting the point you're making about how to even extend the idea. If the point you're making is that as something enters kind of viability in the culture,
Yeah.
okay, this is fully accepted and normalized. Some of
Hmm.
that artistic spark has to go somewhere else. I think George Harris had a really interesting quote.
Yeah.
He said he was a huge fan of Monty Python, and he goes,
Right.
"Well, the whatever creative spirit possessed us, we were the Beatles. It must have gone to Monty Python because look at the way they're innovating
Interesting.
and pushing the edge of comedy."
Yeah.
And I think, some historian may swat me over the head for saying
Hmm.
this because I'm assuming a lot here, but the point stands. It's like you have the Gutenberg Revolution, and then within a
Hmm.
century you have the Renaissance.
Hmm.
You have recorded technologies in the early 1900s becoming publicly
Yeah.
available, mass available, and then you have some of the first generations growing up with that. And then within the century, you have the Beatles. You have, a
Hmm.
lot of people would say the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. That's like the best decades of recorded music,
Sure.
because I mean that's also a majority of the decades we've had of recorded music, really.
Yeah.
But that things today, everything's self-referential, everything's ironic.
Hmm.
It's hard to find. I think the word we're looking for is that once things become normalized, mainstreamed, the authenticity,
Yeah.
and the willingness to look foolish, kind of goes away because it becomes too expensive. If
Yeah.
I think podcasts are another version of that. If you
For
look
sure.
at just the now, it's like I know people have a lot of opinions about Joe Rogan,
Yeah.
but it's interesting how 10 years ago, if you just look at the way he was behaving about his podcast, and now you can just tell he's a little more shrewd and
Hmm.
tactile about, okay, who does he let on? Who is he going to talk to? What topics is he going to bring up? And I think that's just because, the whatever artistic and punk spirit possessed that at the time, that's gone away. And I think what it's gone to, for better or for worse, is live streaming, because people want the authenticity, especially in this digital age where you can edit anything. Of it's like,
Yeah.
okay, what's going on right now? So even if that just is just illusory, I think that's where the young folks are at right now.
I would broadly agree with that. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Seems like I don't listen to Joe Rogan, but seems like he still has some crazy people on there. but I do think knowing you're being watched by more people is something that can change you. It's something I wonder about my YouTube channel and try to be careful about. Like, I'm growing a lot more subscribers and I'm really happy about that, but I really hold I really I really try to not be constrained by them. Like, if I want to do this, I'm going to do it. Like, if I start researching a philosopher and I'm really not feeling it, I'll switch gears and work on someone I'm more interested in. And, you know, whenever I post videos, and I love everyone who comments, so no harsh words, but a lot of the time, I do like reviews of movies and personal thoughts, and there's responses like, do Hegel. And stuff like that. And I'm like, takes time.
Oh,
But so I think just the thing you said, which I like a lot, is willing to look foolish, and I think that's important. I think we use this word authenticity a lot, and I think maybe it is authenticity, but it's something a little more granular, like willing to look foolish, maybe being part of a certain culture or group that has different norms and expectations, so knowing you're not going to break those. Like, I guess the way I think about it is, there's a Stan Brakhage, experimental director, once said that a lot of movies are made for nobody, and it feels like that when a medium gets too big. It's like it's not exclusionary anymore. It's not made for this particular group of people. It's made as broad as it can be to kind of optimize for as many people, because kind of the patterns have all been worked out. And so I think when media are new, meaning like plural of mediums are new, um, those kinks aren't worked out. So there's still kind of a cultural background that has different assumptions. So it feels more like visiting a foreign country before like travel became super widespread and everyone can go anywhere, and a lot of places around the world start looking the same. Like, I'm entering what it's like to be a metalhead or an anime fan, and there's weird norms here that aren't like the rest of society, that kind of thing.
and that's something this is one of the big questions I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
I look at my parents' generation, Gen X, and there
Yeah.
are probably 100 movies,
Yeah.
several hundred albums that all of them know. They
Right.
could probably quote Back to the Future back and forth. They can quote
Yeah.
a million songs. They can quote Star Wars back and forth. But I have a sister that's several years older and a brother that's several years younger. So I'm in an interesting place here
Yeah.
where it's the world of online entertainment and music
Hmm.
and all the new stuff and all the retro stuff that I'm into. Uh, that's completely divorced from them. And it's not that they don't have cultural interests themselves. It's just that that's in completely different areas. Like I'm really
Yeah.
into like rock, indie, experimental
Mm.
music. My brother's pure rap. My sister's pure rap and R&B. So it's interesting how to get us to have anything in common
Mhm.
and to sit down and go, hey, did you hear about this thing? Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I did. It has to be like Mr. Beast, who's probably the biggest entertainer ever for someone
Sure.
his age, you know, or it has to be Avengers Endgame, which is one of the highest profiting movies ever, or it
Yeah.
has to be Donald Trump almost getting assassinated, which is one of the biggest
Sure.
political stories of the past decade. So it
Right.
is really interesting how the subculture. The culture of having subcultures, in some ways, it's like, okay, that's perfect. You know, me and you, we have a similar niche, philosophical
Yeah.
anime interests. Here we are,
Yeah.
we're finding each other. Now we're doing a podcast together.
Right.
Whereas in previous eras, it's almost like you would be forced to conform to a cultural consensus, either resisting it or accepting it. And a lot of people will go, that's a bad thing. And I agree, like, yeah, there are a ton of
Hmm.
negatives there. But it seems like one positive that we don't understand now is having
Hmm.
a cultural language that anybody can participate in broadly, you know?
Yeah.
Because I think now it's at the point where if I were to sit down with my siblings and talk about what are the problems in societies today, beyond political topics, I don't think we'd really be able to come to a consensus where I can
Mm.
cite evidence of, well, did you see in this movie, there's this thing,
Interesting.
this musician did this is this thing. I think
Yeah.
they'd be like, we're living in a different reality, you know?
That's right.
So,
That is an interesting point. I listened to the last podcast you did, and I know you touched on this a little. And one thing I do think about that, which I think about a lot, is there's kind of a, I think there's legitimate problems with that, but there's kind of a, I mean, like a lot of things, there's kind of a doom porn angle on it where, oh, the young people are so cut off from each
yeah.
other, and that gets played up. And part of me almost feels like it's like, the moment we overcome some of these old problems, like the way society punishes people for having different interests, or the way society looks down on another good example. A lot of people, there's this whole thing about the young people are so perverse, and internet porn is turning them all into gooners and stuff like that. And these can be real problems, but like with sexuality, for example, it feels like we've had decades and decades where I think a lot of the time, because of Christian upbringing, people just were made to feel shame about having sexual relations with themselves and kind of feel alienated from it. In America, especially, this kind of puritanical culture. And then we finally get over that, and immediately people want to take it all back. Like, okay, we got to go back to repressing any kind of sex positivity now that we're experiencing this problem. And I'm like, okay, well, we have this new problem, but let's not undo all the progress we made about this. And I feel like maybe it's similar about, people becoming more uh individualized in their interests. But I do think there can be a problem with it. Like, you know, uh if you have the internet, you can optimize to find people who have the same interests as you much more effectively, whether they're living in the US or Sweden or Mexico or across the world. And that can be a little bit difficult when the people you feel closest to are so far away from you physically that almost it's like you feel, why do I even bother with people close to me? So I do feel like that's a genuine problem. And I will just, and I'll say, my background, I feel like I was a patient zero of this in a lot of way. I've talked a bit about my upbringing before, but I grew up I had a unusual upbringing in some ways. I went to like kindergarten and first grade, and then for most of elementary through middle school, I was homeschooled, but not for religious reasons. My parents are more like on the kind of hippie granola side of that.
Mhm.
But I was homeschooled, and I had other homeschooling friends, so I feel like I was really there's a lot of those foundational kind of interests in media, like you talk about, I was cut off from, except for cartoons. I watched the same cartoons as everyone on Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network, but I never owned game consoles growing up, so I never played like Halo and
Mhm.
a lot of stuff like that. I had friends who did, so I partook a bit, but I feel like I developed kind of unique interests at an early age and was allowed to kind of sprout in weird different ways. And there's been advantages and disadvantages to that, I think. So I feel like a lot of uh kids now maybe grow up in a more similar way to the way I did. And I think there's I think I'm glad about that in a lot of ways, but sometimes it does feel a little lonely.
Yeah. I think I want to talk to you, considering your background, I do want
Yeah.
to talk to you about the idea of the kind of Luddite class, I
Mm.
guess, emerging or uh, growing of
Yeah.
people saying, we do need to go back in ways. It's not just technology; it's the way technology has affected our attitudes about
Yeah.
sex or about our
Right.
interests or how we spend our time, etc.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to call people like that reactionaries. And I think
Yeah.
broadly, yeah, because they're talking about a problem, but they're not offering solutions.
Sure.
But I think a point is well made. Of it's you
Mhm.
look at, like, especially among Gen Z, such an odd statistic is it's just younger people just are not having sex as much as almost any generation
Right.
prior. Even though the talk about it and
Yeah.
explicit content has been so normalized, but just people don't talk about it. So I mean, people don't
Right.
do it. I mean,
Yeah.
so that's just such an interesting phenomenon. People would point to a million different reasons for that.
Yeah.
And then there's also a movement to say we need to reject digital media, go back to reading, engaging with core text physically on a
Yeah.
page. That's the best way to learn something.
Hmm.
What do you think? I mean, first of all, how have you, if you
Hmm.
don't mind, how have
Yeah.
you tried to balance that in your own life, especially because the content you do,
Yeah.
you're a real original thinker, and I can tell
Thank
that
you.
you put a lot of rigor and thinking into how you present an idea, what you're going to say about it. Is this just stuff that people are just saying somewhere else?
Mm.
So I guess as kind of a creator, I ask you that, and also just as an individual trying to
Yeah.
navigate the like information hellscape of
Sure.
2026.
Yeah. Uh yeah, I don't have the final answer, but I guess for me I do feel like there is advantages to using paper and physical media, but I mean I have an e-reader and I read a lot of stuff on there, so I'm not anti new technology by any means. I guess for me the thing the thing I have trouble with, and not, I still engage with it on some level, but I think the big difference that a lot of people don't haven't really grasped is it's not just that it's more common, it's the change from having chronological feeds to algorithmic feeds. I think is a big one. Cuz like chronologically that's kind of the way the internet had been up until like mid 2010s. That's the way newspapers are, that's the way mailing lists are. It's just you're keeping up with something. Whenever a lot of people talk to me, whenever people talk, it is weird to talk to young Zoomers and Alphas who are like, "What was the internet like back in the 2000s?" And I'm like, "I never knew this day would come, and I'd have to say something about it." But I always answer, one of the things I say is that there was a lot more waiting. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like there was a lot more waiting for websites to upload, waiting for people to be on at the same time. Uh, Looking back at the same animation or webcomic you already read because there wasn't anything new. Um, and I think that having going from a chronological kind of delivery system to an algorithmic one has changed the way we relate to technology a lot, and I think adds to that siloing effect. And so I made a video about this kind of, but so whenever I use technology, I just try to avoid algorithmic stuff to the degree that I can. I don't always, I still check my YouTube algorithm sometimes, but I try to just look at my subscribed channels and look at them in chronological order, what they've uploaded, and search for something that I'm interested in, rather than I try to go out of my way to not just sit there passively and be fed by the algorithm, but I don't think anyone can resist it entirely. And then aside from that, I don't, if I can help it, I don't look at any algorithm news items because I think that's
Mm-hmm.
particularly uh, kind of pernicious. So it's weird, but I mean, the primary way I get my news is I just go to the when I go to the corner store, I pick up physical copy of the New York Times and just read it, or read the headlines at least. But when you read headlines on a paper, it's even if you're just skimming the headlines there, I feel like it's better because the text is right under it, so you can actually check things instead of just on the way on your phone where you see the headline and then you feel like you know the whole story and don't even bother to read it, you know?
I definitely agree. I really think we're going to reach the point, maybe in the next decade, where,
Mhm.
and in the same way that back in the day it was seen as lower class to be tan
Mhm.
because that meant you're
Sure.
working outside a lot, to be pale and maybe even a little chubby. That's kind of
Yeah.
the ideal because that means like how privileged your life is.
Right.
Now it's kind of the opposite. If you have the luxury to spend time in the sun and to exercise
Exactly.
and not sit around on a desk job, then it's like, wow, you must be part of a aristocracy in a way. I think
Mhm.
in the same way, I really think as someone who's been young and you know what's really interesting is these kind of short form scrolling, this mode of content, algorithmic. It
Yeah.
really did kind of creep out of nowhere because I'm as
Yeah.
someone who that happened about halfway through my time in high school,
Yeah.
about 2019, early 2020s when it first
Yeah.
emerged. I remember
Yeah.
everyone going in 2018. It was, oh, TikTok, that's
Yeah.
ridiculous, that's
Right.
weird. If that's just a dancing
Gonna
app,
be the
and
next
then
Vine, you know.
right,
Remember
right. And then
Vine? Yeah.
suddenly, and then suddenly it became this everything app.
Right.
And then COVID definitely didn't help that. But now everyone, it went from being like, oh, that's kind of weird. I'm just going to stick
Mm.
to watching YouTube a couple hours a day
Yeah.
to, I think that it's no exaggeration to say in the United States, on average, people are spending 5 to 8 hours, young people are spending 5 to 8 hours on their phone if they have nothing to
Yeah.
do that day.
Yeah, it's pretty
So
crazy.
that's one element of just how I guess how easily it hacked our psychology. But
Mhm.
so I pointed as someone who's spent
Mhm.
at a really unfortunate amount. I would hate to even see
Yeah.
in front of me as a statistic amount on my phone. I
Yeah.
can say that it get to the point where having access to almost all the information at a given time is
Yeah.
almost the same as knowing nothing. So in the same way, I think
Sure.
maybe a thing that will be seen as higher class or something
Mhm.
is having the if you want to call it the discipline or the
Right.
wherewithal or the ability to avoid the temptation of algorithms by
Mm.
being someone who just goes, oh, hey, did you see what Trump said? And the million
Yeah.
responses to it by all the commentators. It's
Right.
like, well, I read it in the Times, and I got
Sure.
one comment. Yeah, I got one set of commentary
Yeah.
by a distinguished writer, and that's about it. I didn't
Yeah.
mess with all of that in the world.
Yeah.
And I did want to talk to you
Yeah.
as well about how I think one of the issues, so we talked about some of the mental health concerns of technology earlier. I
Mhm.
think one thing that's just kind of odd, I haven't really heard people say this,
Mhm.
is the way that we are interfacing with reality is
Mhm.
identical, even across all these subcultures. And what I mean by
Mm.
interface, a lot of people mean that to mean just how you approach reality. I mean that
Mhm.
quite literally. Of it's
Okay.
TikTok, Instagram,
Mm.
Reddit,
Sure.
even the iPhone, the OS, all of
Yeah.
these things have the exact same screens that we're all
Mm.
navigating. There's where the apps
Sure.
are, there's where the post button is, there's where the search button is. So if people are making the kind of Luddite point of, oh my gosh, return to a tech hive mind, it's like, well, I mean, there's another area where they're kind of right. It's
Yeah.
so I wanted to ask you if people have come up with alternatives of, we're going to move away from the internet just being basically five websites, Facebook,
Yeah.
Instagram, Reddit, that encompasses all content. And instead, we're going to kind of do the opposite. We're just going to go back to specialized websites that are on
Mhm.
their own. They're not part of a mega corporation.
Mhm.
They're not moderated by people that have nothing to do with the form itself,
Mhm.
etc. And this is a huge, the indie web movement.
Yeah.
People are talking about it online. Uh, I asked you in an email. You gave a really thoughtful response.
Thanks.
Yeah, is that just LARP, as they say, or do
Yeah.
you think that there's legitimate, especially as AI content is
Right.
flooding all these places,
Yeah.
people going back into these different little
Mm.
sections, these little cozy homes of websites?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Uh, I don't know. I do find some of the personal sites I see like on NeoCities and stuff do seem very LARP to me, for lack of a better words, in that they seem like they're explicitly trying to look exactly like a site from 2005 would look like. And I get
Mhm.
that because it it looks a lot better than most of the eyesore news sites I see today. I can sympathize, but I personally I'm not a big fan of that kind of sparkly GIF overload look that looks like the middle schooler site from 2000s, and a lot of people, I guess, are nostalgic for that. I like something that's just kind of simple and clean without a lot of ads, interesting CSS, but not necessarily flashy to the point where it becomes harder to navigate. And so I wouldn't say, at least for me, it doesn't feel like LARP. It just feels like, over my time I've been a part of a lot of forums where I've posted stuff. I've had
a lot of blogs. I used Tumblr quite a lot when that was a big site, and I just never felt like any of them were quite. I never had the full control I wanted to make it look exactly how I could. So then when I just I had some friends, and I was playing a lot of Toho at the time, and one of my Toho friends just had someone I kind of knew at the time had a personal site where he just talked about shooting games and stuff, and I was like, that's cool. I wonder if I could do something like this. And then I just started looking at old sites I knew and kind of inspecting Element to teach myself some HTML, and then I realized, yeah, I I like the idea of having a site where I can just host my own stuff, and that was around the time I'd really read a lot of Heidegger, so I felt like I have these messages I want to put out to the world. And yeah, for me at least, I guess it didn't feel like LARP or cope, but it kind of felt like just finally having the control and the autonomy of it felt really nice. And there is a part of me which is like rediscovering how something I wanted to do when I was younger but didn't have the means to. But I do feel like there's just very good reasons to have your own website. I feel like if nothing else, just democratizing information is good. So like if you like some anime or some TV show or some movie, make a fan site. There used to be a million of those, but because people saw it themselves as being responsible for contributing to indexing information about those things online. Whereas now it's just like we have Wikipedia, we have the blank wiki. Whereas back then it was like, well, even if you're just saying the same information, it helps to have it in multiple places in case one goes down, you know?
Also, unfortunately, you have that search for the holy grail that is virality. You know, it's like if you're talking about, let's just say Hunter x Hunter,
Yeah.
10, and there's 100,000 people on the subreddit today.
There you go.
It's like, well,
Yeah.
10 years ago, that might have been 1,000 different forums with 100,000 people spread
Right.
throughout all of them. You know,
Yeah.
but now it's like it's in one place. So whenever you're posting something, your incentive isn't just let's have a conversation, but you want that to rise to the top. So so earnestly, so more people are engaging with it, but also kind of deviously, you get that rush of I got more upvotes, I got 100 upvotes, 300 upvotes. What about the internet developments you've seen by being, I guess, an avid user over the past 2 decades, decade and a half,
at least?
Yeah. Are there any that really surprised you that you didn't see coming?
It's hard to say. It's weird to say because in a lot of ways I feel like I've been good at predicting these kind of things. Like to get a little political, in like the 2010s when I realized, this was when people called it the first like kind of big anti-SJW wave, like what would be called like anti-woke content now.
Yeah.
I remember when a lot of those guys started getting popular, and I thought they were stupid, and I didn't think they were very smart. But I also had a lot of criticisms for what would have been called SJW, like kind of some excesses of leftist thought or politically correct thought that I still think are disagreeable. And I think we're a lot more like nowadays I feel like a lot of people are just more honestly able to have these discussions about things like I don't know, cultural appropriation or that term or stuff like that, which was always one that I had a lot of trouble with because like I'd been to Japan and people gave me a kimono to wear, and I could tell they were super happy and excited to see me wear it. So I was like, I don't get this idea where that's always a bad thing. Like cultures are supposed to propagate. But anyway, I have a essay on my site where I talk about that in more nuance. But anyway, what I was gonna say was I remember at that time feeling like this is really bad because it's always fun to piss off the squares, people who can't take a joke. And so I imagine like if we don't have these conversations honestly, there's going to be a huge right-wing resurgence of young guys who just want to offend people because it's funny. And
Yeah.
but I guess in terms of surprises, I would say I was surprised kind of how extreme a lot of that has become, and how a lot of sites have become more prone to censorship on both sides.
Yeah, I think a great example of kind of what you're getting at is, Blue Sky was created because
Hmm.
people, one of the core reasons was just people didn't want to support Twitter, now X, under Elon Musk.
Right.
Completely understandable.
Yeah.
But then it got to the point where I have an account on both sites, and
Mm.
if a major news event happened and you scroll on your homepage, you're
Yeah.
getting two echo chambers of what
There you
happened.
go. Yeah.
So it's not that either side is unjustified for, well, I don't want to, I don't want to be around people with those opinions. They're just trolling. They're
Yeah.
just doing engagement
Right.
bait. It's like, okay, well, on an individual level, fair enough. Do what you
Yeah.
want. Do whatever comforts you. But
Right.
then on a mass level, it's like, wow, it's not just that we disagree on what the conclusions are from an event. It's
Hmm.
we're at the point where people are disagreeing on whether an event happened and what the core details, the defining details of an event actually were.
Right.
Uh, I think just a small example, like not to play the whole like, oh, both sides are evil.
Sure.
I'm not
Yeah.
making that point, but
Right.
just a brief example. You had a lot of people on the left saying, no, the Trump assassination attempt was this huge conspiracy, and here's why.
Mm. Okay.
And then you had people on the right saying, the Charlie Kirk assassination was this
Sure.
huge conspiracy, and here's why.
Yeah.
And it's just like, wow. So it's just interesting how whenever even
Yeah.
bringing up an idea like that, you need to go through these filters of, is it even worth bringing up? Because what if they
Right.
start talking about, no, this group did it, no, this group did it. And, if you're
Yeah.
not about to get on board with my theory, that's because you're right wing, you're left wing, you're a communist,
Yeah.
you're fascist, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess that reminded me of something. I guess if I was going to say the thing that surprised me most is I feel like so many people just forgot the oldest rule of the internet, which is you don't feed the trolls.
Yeah, yeah,
Like that's, I mean, you might not like it, doesn't feel good, but the only thing you can do is ignore it. And I mean, that's ancient law. And I always felt like, well, when Donald Trump started getting popular, I feel like the reason he shot to mediocrity was he taught a bunch of boomers how fun it is to troll people, basically.
yeah.
And a lot of people played into it. So I feel like when we abandoned that, it was all for naught.
I think another damaging lesson he taught is that rhetoric in the information economy, rhetoric actually can get you very far. And I
That's right.
think we're at the point where it's in its most naked capacity when he's talking about what we're going to do with Iran.
Yeah.
And the moment before the market closes for the day, he goes, "Oh, it's actually great. We're thinking about pulling out." And then the
Right.
second the market closes, he goes, "No, we're only doubling down."
Yeah.
And it's to the point where it's like, if rhetoric does have this much power,
Hmm.
that is, that's market manipulation. But in
Right.
a way, it's like e- e- everything feels like a form of manipulation beyond just the
Yeah.
psychology of the individual. But it's like our institutions are a couple arguments away over a few decades from being completely dismantled or from doubling down on their mission.
Yeah.
Um,
At the same time, I do feel like some of the more toxic elements of what I called like SJW or woke culture have kind of faded away, and I feel like I don't see as much crazy stuff as I did like when I was in college. I feel like that's kind of, as that's mainstreamed, it's kind of taken on a few basic tenets about um police brutality or so on. And whether, I mean, I'm not going to say honestly my opinion because I'm not informed enough, but I do feel like I see a lot less of that essentialization and demonization. At least maybe I'm just ignoring it in the right places, but I also feel like it's moved a lot more into talking about class, which I think was
Yeah.
fueling a lot of the resentment in the first place, which is probably a good development in my opinion.
I think another positive of that is that if there is any chance of a positive coalition between the right and left wing, I think it'd be on
Mm.
the issue of class. Because I
Yeah,
think a lot of people being disenchanted with, MAGA on the right.
yeah,
One of the big things they cite is, well, it just feels like these billionaires promise us all these things and never do them.
yeah,
And someone on the left would go, hey, yeah, like, yeah, we know.
yeah.
um, so I think that's an issue that obviously the case in our system that, this takes no level of expertise to say that it's just if you it's extremely profitable to be in office. And I
Right.
think one thing specifically the Iran conflict people aren't noticing is people are going, oh, why isn't Congress doubling down? Why isn't Congress saying we need to take a vote on this immediately? And I can't help but think it's because if you're in Congress making millions, the
Mm.
less work you have to do, the better. Because I think one thing
Sure.
the founders didn't see coming
Yeah.
is that any branch would say, we actually want less power. But if you
Sure.
introduce
Yeah.
profit motives, it's like, well,
Mhm.
yeah, we'll take less work. If I don't have to take a position on this, so the next time I'm on the campaign trail, I can make
Mhm.
up whatever story I want. There's no record of me going on the record.
Mhm.
Then it's like, yeah, that's much preferable.
Yeah.
I think to go back to just like general society right now,
Mm.
there's a great book called Bullshit Jobs
Oh
that
yeah.
tackles this, yeah, that tackles this idea that it's just like almost all work is kind of what I just described in a way of it's all
Right.
these office jobs where people are going like, well, the least amount of work I can do uh, for the maximum profit or whatever, like that's what I want, And I
Yeah.
think two things: one, people go, well, that's obviously just human nature, but
Mhm.
I think another point is that I think that really indicates a breakdown in shared values. Like it's kind of
Mhm.
sneered at and looked down upon. By a lot of younger generations, perhaps mean anything under Gen X, of the
Yeah.
idea of thinking that there is a kind of collective good to believe in.
Right.
And in a way, I kind of view that, I guess, even though that leftist thinking should tell you that, yeah, there
Mhm.
should be a collective good we go after. But
Yeah.
ironically, I think it's the left wing in American politics today that sneers and looks down at anybody that makes that their platform. So
Yeah.
it's just really weird, I guess, cynical optimism.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
then on the right, it's like you have this optimistic pessimism
Mm.
about, like, it's really strange and really perverted
Yeah.
view of the world. I think if you want to say we're in a crisis of meaning, I think
Mhm.
those are two areas where the rot is just so clear.
Yeah.
Um, but all this to say, I mean, what do you think? I know
Yeah.
that's not really
Sure.
a jumping off point there,
Yeah.
but
No, that is an interesting point. I do think I thought a bit about this, and I think it's important to have structures and rituals of meaning in society. There's a that's a point when I research Heidegger, that's something he talks a lot about, is about the idea of the festival and why we lose things like festivals in our modern day. And I thought about that a lot while I was in Japan, and there are festivals there because what he says is a festival is whenever a people unites and returns back to what's primordial, or like gets kind of reacquainted with the fountainhead of meaning. It's like we have all these conceptual structures in our daily lives, and then as a festival, we come together and kind of get out of that and meld together and realize the foundations of those and how they are constructed, but also why they're constructed and why they're meaningful. Kind of like the Sabbath in a Christian context or any other thing. So I think having rituals like that is important. One thing I think we kind of lack today is a little inconvenience in partaking in society. It's so easy to optimize, like, I can talk to you at this time, or, you can join whenever, or we can just hop on the Discord whenever you're available. But one thing I'm trying to do on my site, for example, is create like movie nights or game nights or things like that, where it has to be a certain time and you have to inconvenience yourself a bit to make it fit your schedule. And of course, I think when people have that motivation to come together in spite of it and add a little inconvenience to it, it means more ultimately.
Yeah, I think what gets in the way of this, what's the big boogeyman we're
Yeah.
kind of talking about here?
Yeah.
I think on the individual level, it's just the irony poisoning of
Yeah.
almost everything,
Yeah. Right.
What thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, I mean that's an old point. I don't know.
Yeah,
It's
right,
weird.
right.
Yeah, but well, I don't know that old. It's weird to me, but I always remember thinking that kind of irony poisoning idea. I was like, where did that kind of start? And I think the show that kind of did this was Tim and Eric. Awesome show. Great job. I don't know. It feels like that was one of the first shows to have like a real kind of detached, ironic kind of we're so bad sense of humor. And I thought it was funny when it was on. But sometimes I always look at that show and it feels like that was kind of the transition from to the ironic age, I guess you could say. And maybe that was like when hipsters were really a big thing, and maybe that had something to do with it. But yeah, it's hard to say. I don't know. I guess I'm just too autistic for all that irony stuff, I guess. I got yeah, it I do feel like there's kind of a fear of being yourself because there's such a culture of attacking what's different, and I think the only antidote is to just learn to ignore that kind of stuff and not feed trolls, and don't be afraid to put yourself out there. And I do wonder if like in the age of AI there's going to be more demand for people who are authentic in weird ways and like draw shitty DeviantArt pictures and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah. One thing a lot, I remember when AI, in 2023, kind of, it
Mhm.
first became clear, okay, shoot, this is moving
Yeah,
faster than we thought.
of
I thought the
course.
public caught wind of that. The big question was, oh, what jobs will we have? What jobs will we have,
Yeah.
in a future like that? And I just thought, I think the bigger question, again, this sounds a little hippie, but it's just
Mhm.
like, well, how would you feel? It's like, even if you were given freedom from the enslavement of labor, it's like, well, how would you spend your time? Would you
Yeah.
even really know? Would you know how to fulfill yourself outside of external measurements, etc.?
Hmm.
And I think, well, on that, first of all, I mean, have you ever thought about writing a book? Do you ever plan on it? Speaking of putting yourself out there.
Yeah, I've toyed with the idea. I feel like one idea I'd like to turn into a book is kind of this an essay on I've talked about this before, but kind of the Western fear of objects. And this is something I talk about in one of my videos called Art and Objecthood in particular, is I feel like it's a weird idea that I think goes back to Plato, where Plato is one of the first people to say in the West, like, there's the real thing and there's the imitation of it. Mimesis, or mimesis is his word for it. There's the real, the ultimate real, which is forms, and the things we see, which are kind of imitations of the real, the most real, higher realm of abstract forms. And then artists engage in mimesis where they make imitations of those imitations of the real, like a statue that looks like a real person, but a real person is just kind of a pale reflection of the abstract ideal of a person. And Plato, it's actually, if you read Plato really closely and honestly, and I guess there's multiple interpretations, but in a lot of ways, he almost sounds like a jihadist because he's so afraid of the idea of like representation being evil in a sense. Where he says, I think there's a famous in the Republic, he said he would exile all the poets and artists because in his idea, truth is inherently good and falsehood is inherently bad, and poets and artists and all those engage in a kind of deception in making images that look real but are fake. And that is that sounds like a really strange obsession, but I think personally that Plato was born in an era where the idea of real thing and representation was a lot less defined than we would define it today. And in the Asian world, I don't think there was ever a figure like Plato who like really drew that line so explicitly. And then I think Plato's influence is kind of reinterpreted melded with the Jewish tradition, where God says, don't make any graven images. And then the Islamic tradition, which is really extreme about this. And I think that there's a through line to that, to kind of fears of indulgence in art objects, and then fears of like sexual objectification, looking at someone as an object. And I don't think you see that in the East, where people are still very attached to objects and almost treat them with respect and reverence of their own, like they're living in a sense. Japan's a famous example of this. And so I think that's an interesting, I've never seen anyone write something about that. And I think it would be a very interesting cultural study to do. So if I was going to write a book, maybe it would be about that.
That's an interesting idea. And where I can think in the modern world that connects, in our hyper information age, is if you have an abstract idea, and if you do, create a form of it, if that form is even slightly off, and you know that will be replicated over and over, I can see where that anxiety comes from. And speaking of anxiety, like one example would, the French existentialist, I believe this is the case, that and a lot of the English translations, the first a couple decades, their work was being translated into the English. Instead of anxiety, the word angst was used, the English word angst.
Right. That's from Heidegger originally.
Yeah. So there's this. Angst, implies the way we understand it in just common American lexicon is, that's more like a choice. That's more an attitude you have. That's not really a condition you're experiencing. Whereas anxiety, we put a lot more weight into that.
Like happens to you.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think about this fear of objects, because I, like a lot of us, I fear a lot of things about AI developments. But I do think it's interesting, there's a point a lot of people always make, is that if you look at like anime media and Western media, in Western media the robots always become evil and try to kill us, and in Eastern media the robots are always nice. A lot of the times the robots are like more human than the humans and are bullied by humans. And I do wonder about that, kind of, if that's an animistic idea where that uncanny valley doesn't exist as much in like Japan and some of those countries, because they believe that everything has a spirit inside of it, and there's gods inside of trees and rocks, and so robots too. So sometimes I wonder if my fear over AI is kind of a remnant of that fear of Western idolatry, but I do for now I am sticking to it.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, in an anime like Gurren Lagann, one of the most classic mecha anime. Just that's one of the few mechas I've seen. But there's this idea that it's so obvious it doesn't need to be said, that the purpose of these large robots and mechs is to be an extension of the human will, of the will to conquer and go out and take and develop, etc. And a lot of people would go, "Oh, that's a very Western idea." But it's interesting you say that, because I see, there's the duality of like, I could see how that could be identified as very Western. But then also there's this idea of, it's like again, in all of our science fiction, the first thing it jumps to is human annihilation. And I guess those ideas don't contradict, because I mean that would make sense. That it's like, on one hand, we want the furthering of comes from an anxiety of extinction, ultimately, perhaps. So.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. Do you what writer? I think I'd asked this earlier, but I think we got sidetracked. But are there any writers? Because right now it is interesting finding a writer that's able to synthesize all these cultural elements. They've seen, the anime that are doing interesting things. They've seen the Western films. They're following the politics. They're following the literature. They have a deep study of the classics. Pretty interesting personality type to try to find. So I was asked you, but I think this guy's like a Slavoj Žižek. I think, if I'm pronouncing it right, I think he does a good job of that. Thomas Pynchon, even though he's a bit of an older writer, I think he may be the master of doing that, of synthesizing all these different elements of culture. Is there anyone today that you point to that you're like, this is a thought leader or an artist that really understands where we are, all things considered?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't have immediate ones coming to mind. I remember when I was first reading like Heidegger pointed out like certain figures that he thought were like basically should be worshipped almost like gods, or worshipped is a strong word, but seen as like gods of our new age, or like people who were particularly important for following thought. And the one he picks above anyone else is Friedrich Hölderlin, who's a German romantic poet. Um, so he thought Hölderlin was like the best illustrator of his thoughts, even though he came like over 100 years before him. He thought he was the most appropriate for the modern age. And I tried to think, what are there examples of people, whether it's thinkers or artists or whoever nowadays, who would be our kind of Hölderlin type figures. And one guy I always really one guy I liked a lot, but I think he's fallen off in recent years, but is Zune, the creator of the Toho Project series, because I really appreciated what he did in looking at a lot of classical Japanese kind of aesthetics and translating them to a modern kind of anime audience with moe subculture and video games and stuff. And I think like if you look at the way he makes his art there, it looks very flat, almost like a Japanese standing screen without a lot of depth. It has that kind of patterned aesthetic. The characters in it look cute, but they almost look more like traditional Japanese dolls than normal anime girls. And the bullet patterns, I feel like, is almost a way that's similar to like calligraphy. Traditionally in Japanese, you'd understand a lot about a person by how they wrote their characters with a brush. And in those games, I feel like there's a lot of personality put into the way they attack you with certain bullets. So I always thought that Zune was a good example of someone who managed to take a lot of lessons from the past and want to transmit them to the present in a way, knowing that, he's kind of replicating things that already have gone out of existence and passed away. And I guess he would be engaging in what Heidegger calls safeguarding, kind of finding pockets of areas to keep traditional ways alive. I also thought of a musician named Susumu Hirasawa, or Hirasawa Susumu, who's a Japanese electronic musician who I just really like the way his music feels. It feels very primordial and ancient. But those were the only ones in my list of potential gods, so I'd have to think more about it. Yeah.
Yeah. There's also we talked a little earlier about art forms kind of,
Yeah.
to use a word incorrectly, just kind of
Sure.
expiring, being
Yeah.
past their due of
Yeah.
innovation. And I guess I'll ask you, do you think the combination of different art forms of older ones, I guess even the word archaic could be used in
Yeah.
newer ones? Like, for example, I think David Foster Wallace's
Mhm.
Infinite Jest is still the best novel about the internet. And that's not
Yeah.
even Glaze of the book so much as to
Right.
say, I don't think another writer has come along and has captured how the like endless pleasure is so
Right.
isolating.
Sure. Yeah, I read Infinite Jest back in, like, when would that have been? 2010, 2011. So I'd be interested to read it now with more context, but I think that makes sense. As to whether things can become outdated, it's hard to say, but I feel like all great artistic innovation has to return to the source. And a lot of the times the people who can innovate farthest are the ones who have the power to look back far enough. Like Picasso and a lot of Picasso and a lot of the early modern sculptors and painters were these abstract expressionists were inspired by things like ancient Greek Mycenaean figures and really ancient kind of forms of art, or like really old Custa traditionally rooted tribal art of Oceania, like tikis or totem poles or things like that. So I do think a lot of the times when a medium is new, something gets funneled through it, which is very ancient.
Well, hey, you had mentioned studying history, and
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of looking back, when you look at history, do you see the relationship. I'd asked my guest this in my last episode,
Yeah.
and same question for you because it's one that's just
Hmm.
been fascinating me.
Yeah.
Do you see it as a linear progression, or
Mm.
as a loop, or a kind of
Mm.
a combination, a series of loop-de-loops?
Yeah.
So I think the
Yeah.
internet, and
Right.
information technologies, I think really makes you need to stop and pause, when
Yeah.
it comes to something like that. It really is a unique
It
phenomenon.
is. Yeah. It's I guess I've always been kind of traditional in this in that I think of it in terms of timelines and eras and eons and ages. But I do view those as kind of cyclical in a way that I think a lot of patterns kind of repeat and influence each other. I remember some photo or like graph I saw. I don't know who came up with this. I wish I did because I just saw it kind of isolated, but it was a graph. It was from some book. It looked probably written like 50s or earlier. It had some old-fashioned language, but it was talking about conceptions of time across different cultures of the world. And this was a highly speculative, kind of almost new agey idea, but there's something interesting about it where they said the the modern Western idea of time is best implied in the standard Western architecture of the cathedral, always rising up and ever out of a unenlightened past towards a future that is bright and glorious, like the ascent to heaven, and it's constantly linear forward. And they said um, the ancient Greek conception was more of history as a series of patterns and models and archetypes to project onto. And he linked that to the temple somehow. And if I can run through these real quick, I think he said ancient Egypt viewed history as a long march towards the end of death, and everything was a preparation for death, and that's similar to the pyramid. And ancient India, everything was flat and an eternal oneness, where the past and future and present were all one, and everything was eternal with reincarnation and caste system. Nothing ever changes because all is one, and that's in a Buddhist stupa, best exemplified. And then he said in the East Asia, it was a series of different events which are kind of that there's no explicit relation between, but eventually they kind of congeal towards one thing that isn't quite that has a holism of its own, even if it's not quite in a concrete way. And that was best represented by a Chinese garden, which is kind of amorphous and you can wander around and look at a bunch of vistas. So I think about that sometimes and what a conception of history like that would look like that isn't as linear and always forward. And some of those architectural connections are kind of spurious. I think, if you look at East Asia, a pagoda is pretty linear and upwards ascending in the same way a cathedral is. So it seems a little spurious, that connection. But I was struck by that way of thought, and sometimes I think about that. Which of those views of history is the most endearing?
With your interest in art, philosophy, history, do you view any do you view art as connecting with the divine? I don't even just mean trying
Yeah.
to, but I mean, do you see that personally, and how do personally you wrestle with that or think about that?
Yeah, I definitely see it as some kind of uniting with the transcendent. I guess I prefer the term transcendent to divine,
Mm.
but I see divine as like a subset of the transcendent. And that can be, but it's a little hard. I think it is, but I think it's also very but I feel like that view is a little limiting because when we think of art as connecting with the divine, we think, or of the transcendent, we think of stuff like the symphonies of Bach and the uh, romantic era paintings like The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog and those kind of really big A art pieces. And I feel like that overlooks a lot of the more things like things that are used, like pottery and what we might call decorative art, and art that is has things that are just landscapes. And I do feel like um that that phrasing sometimes risks giving less value to those more decorative pieces. Or even sometimes when we say decorative in the modern West, it almost has a dismissive attitude, like it's not real art, it's just art that you use. And I don't like that. I know, in East Asia, for example, pottery and calligraphy was considered like the highest forms of art, even more than painting sometimes. And I do feel like uh I feel like ideally art would be a way to connect with the divine, but that also the divine should be kind of all around us and embedded in everyday objects and embedded in our everyday experience, I guess.
That's a great point. And I think people that do make the point of, there are some forms or pieces of art that are more, let's just say, divine or transcendent than
Yeah.
the others. Uh, Although I'm open to that idea, that would be an
Yeah.
interesting position to try to defend because
Mhm.
it's like, well, what that implies that there's a system of measurement that you
Right.
have in your mind, or a way to rank order, and what does that process look like?
Right.
Well, I mean, what do you think? Someone may ask this question as just, well, you're religious or not, but I mean,
Yeah.
I think a better way to ask it is just, what do you view as properties of the transcendent?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll talk a little about my background, I guess. So I grew up in a house that was very non-religious. My dad actually grew up in a very strict Pentecostal church. So when he was young, he spent a lot of his childhood afraid of going to hell and like um had a very negative impression. And when he became a teenager and started thinking of his own, he super rejected all of that and had a very negative view of organized religion, especially the Abrahamic ones. Um, so I didn't grow up with that influence. In fact, if anything, I grew up with kind of a negative view of the Abrahamic religions, which I still have about a lot of aspects of them. Um, so early on, I just kind of became a materialist, atheist, total person like that. But I was always interested in stuff that was unusual or out there, or I liked reading about like, cryptids and UFO encounters and stuff like that. Even if I didn't believe in it, I just thought it was fun, and I wished there was more. I wished there was something more supernatural or uh, eh, unexplained, even if my rational side didn't see any reason to let me believe that kind of stuff. And in spite of that, I've always liked religious imagery in like artworks. I like a lot of my favorite movies were about like priests and monks and spiritual path and things like that because I think I liked mystery. I liked things that were unexplainable. I liked things that make you feel like there's something bigger out there. And I guess that would be kind of how I define the transcendent. And then when I got into college, I took a lot of classes on Buddhism, and I call myself a Buddhist this day. But what that really means to me is it's kind of I have a view of religion that might be a little different, and I've talked about this before. But I think in the West, in Christian and Abrahamic societies, we prioritize belief when we talk about religion, and it's all about whether you believe or not. Whereas in a lot of, if you look at like the most early kind of conceptions of religion, especially in the Eastern world, belief doesn't enter into it as much. It's almost like there's an old there's a Japanese kind of way of thought that goes to religious ceremonies, but also stuff like traditional martial arts and stuff, that the why is contained in the how. So when you learn how to do it, you're learning what it means at the same time. And I think the religious idea is very similar to that. You don't start with belief, you start with going to a shrine and praying and offering a coin and washing your hands or meditating. And then eventually a belief kind of forms around that, but it's much more enforced by just the action of it, and it seems like it's almost the action and ritual that has the real meaning more than the belief. And I think you see this with I feel like ancient Greece and Rome were pretty similar. Like the ritual was paramount, but the and the belief was more a question of philosophy. There's a great excerpt I remember hearing about Cicero, the most famous orator of ancient Rome, who what a teacher told me this, that apparently Cicero was employed as an augur, and what an augur does is a person who performs divination by reading the flight paths of birds, so like makes kind of predictions. And what's funny is Cicero didn't believe in augury; he thought it was all like fake, but he still had to perform it because they were like, it doesn't matter if you think it's fake or not, you have to perform the divinations. And that's like unthinkable in a modern like church. It doesn't matter if you believe or not, you have to preach the word of Jesus or something like that. But I think that you see that kind of thing in a lot of Japanese societies too. Like there's shrine maidens who work at, and people who work at shrines part-time that are not, belief isn't a question. It's just the rituals have to be performed one way or another. It's not about you in a way. And I feel like and even I think Protestantism is kind of the extreme of this, because even if you look at like Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, there's a lot more of that ritual into it. It's a lot more like you're in the club. And that's why, there's a lot of people who still say I'm culturally Catholic, but technically that kind of means I'm not Catholic. I just like partaking in the rituals. But if we saw religion more as ritual coming first, you could still be Catholic, and even if you didn't believe. So from that perspective, I'm a Buddhist because I meditate. I go to a Buddhist temple, and I believe a lot of some of the specific claims of like reincarnation. I'm not totally convinced by. I don't think we know enough to say one way or the other. I do believe a lot of Buddhist philosophy and metaphysics. I think their arguments are pretty convincing, but on that perspective, I would say I'm a Buddhist, and I think I like picturing religion more in those terms.
It's a good answer. Yeah, I had one thing that's interesting is I agree so much that the value of tradition can go beyond just the belief in it itself, the value of ritual. I mean, I think one problem of the kind of, let's just use the beaten phrase of postmodernists to describe this, of the postmodernist project, is to say, well, if you don't have complete faith in the ritual, you're just demeaning yourself, demeaning the ritual, even and participating in it. So therefore, throw the whole thing out if you are in pursuit of truth, beauty, whatever, or whatever good we can make. But I think the big problem is, what will replace that? I think Nietzsche's whole God is dead and we have killed him. That's the oft misinterpreted phrase. I think that's what it's really getting at. So I think to this day, I think the worst excesses of wokeism, social justice that you'd kind of talked about earlier, I think are people that are kind of fun, like humorously, extremely anti-religion, anti-ritual, and yet it seems that they've kind of created their own to help rectify and fill that hole, and they can't see that, and that's just been like really jarring to to witness.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think I am critical of a lot of Abrahamic religions because I think they've brought it on themselves in a lot of ways by having these supremacy narratives that don't allow for as much free thought and allow for more conflict with modernity. A way I often say is kind of like, in a lot of these, if belief is necessary, then you're going to have a problem if science proves that humans evolved from earlier primates or something like that. If belief isn't the core tenet of the religion, it's a much more adaptable and flexible to scientific discoveries, I think.
Just to jump in on that too. I mean, like one thing that whenever I do talk to people that are like dogmatically of an Abrahamic religion, I always bring up the question of interpretation of texts, because if it is, if it is to be assumed, I mean this with no mockery, but if you were to say, the Bible is a divine word, unalienable, you can't adjust it or anything. It's like, well, one, the translation through the centuries, that has happened. Just inevitably, like obviously, if there's any kind of human effort, labor involved, and the fact that you're reading a translation, and the fact that you spend your time reading much else, because you would think if you believe fully that this is the word of God, this is nothing else can touch this, I would just think, my goodness, you have your work cut out for you. Just sit down and read, and memorize, and actualize the principles, think of how easy life is in a way if you
Of
believe
course,
that
yeah.
to be fully the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my point.
Yeah, no, I think that's a
So
great
sorry, so
point.
sorry,
Oh
sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
As opposed to what I've seen a lot of Eastern religions, where
Mhm.
there are some people that go, you know what, I take this all totally literally, and
Mhm.
that's where my faith comes from. And it's like, yeah. And there are others that go, well, I think this is metaphor. They're speaking a metaphor,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah, and I think there's still, like, if you go to Japan to a shrine, like, there's still cohesion. It's still not a free for all. You have to
Yeah,
do the same rituals in the same way as everyone else. And I think that's where the communal aspect of it, because when I hear people say I'm spiritual but not religious, I could kind of define myself that way. But that kind of always gives the impression. Usually people say that it's kind of like, I like a little Buddhism here, a little Christianity here. I'm going to pull this and that and just kind of have this mishmash, which doesn't have much of a. It's kind of navel gazing and solipsistic. It's kind of only you're not part of a tradition and you're not part of a community in the same way. And I think that's what's missing for that kind of thing. And I think that's in those Eastern religions, what's great about having that ritual basis is it does it coheres people still, because there's that aspect that isn't chosen, but kind of the metaphysical aspect of it is more free.
yeah,
And I did want to get your point about the translation. I do think that's interesting, because if you look at Europe, one of the countries that has the high, or I forget what it is exactly, but some of the countries that have the highest, or one of the countries that has the highest percentage of professed Christians in its population is Greece, and of course the New Testament was written in Greek. And sometimes I do wonder how much reading it in the original makes it feel more like a divine text. Like I often, I know other languages. I'm a big fan of translation. I've definitely read a lot of stuff in translation that is very affecting, but uh there is sometimes I read Shakespeare and I'm like, I don't know how anyone who doesn't speak English, like I don't know how anyone could get the same stuff I get just from the sound of these words in a translation. And I maybe there's something very similar of reading the New Testament in the original Greek, even though a lot of people say, it wasn't the Hellenophiles will all bash it, saying, that was peasant Greek. It wasn't what Plato was speaking and all that.
right, right.
But I do feel like, and probably the same thing for the Quran in Arabic and texts like that. So I do wonder about that sometimes.
Yeah, I read multiple translations of Dostoevsky, and I
Mhm.
come away every time with completely different
Mhm.
interpretations, different moods. So I can't
Yeah.
imagine a text that, if we're supposed to perceive this as a holy text, it's like
Yeah.
again, it's passed through. Just one small thing on Catholicism that I can't help but think. I'm sure
Mhm.
there is an answer to this, but it's in a lot of medieval societies you have the peasantry or basically anyone who's not royal,
Yeah.
confesses to the same priest, but the
Right.
king has his own priest to confess to. And it's
That's
like,
right.
wait a minute, that's just a very primitive surveillance system, ultimately. Because I'm
Sure.
sure if the king said, who's divinely anointed king, says, God I have a premonition from God. I need the priest to tell me all the things this person did wrong.
Mhm.
It's like, wait a minute, you
Yeah.
know.
Sure.
Um, and today, I mean, I guess just this is my last question for you. I guess this is kind of a
Sure.
uniting question.
Yeah.
But when it comes to kind of the surveillance technologies of today, where I think it's pretty similar, that we're sold things as, oh, you're just signing up for an email list, you're just
Yeah.
on the social media, make your life so fun, so easy.
Mhm.
It's so simple. You said earlier that convenience, kind of is the problem with a lot of these social issues today.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's like convenience is the death of liberty. Clearly, I mean,
That's
liberty
true.
of the
Yeah.
individual's mind, of on a societal level.
Mhm.
So I guess just to you, companies like Palantir with their surveillance
Yeah.
technologies, what do you see the future of that being? Do you see any meaningful resistance emerging, or is this just an area that's like not to be
Yeah.
pessimistic, but it's just like, well, we kind
Yeah.
of cat's out of the bag there.
Uh, it's hard to say. I hope there would be resistance. Um, the most dystopian kind of future would be something where we kind of have to give up the internet entirely and move entirely to the darknet or I2P or these alternative protocols. And possibly there's laws in those places, but I would like to think and hope that people can find small ways to resist, and but also don't um don't ruin your life over it. Do create good, fun things on the internet. Use it the way you want to. Use it in a way that feels authentic for you. Design your own website. Just don't take it too seriously and have fun, I guess, would be my advice to anyone. And I think that's the message I want people to take away.
Well, Jade Vine, thank you so much for coming
Yeah.
on. Let people know, where can they find you? Where can they find your content?
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm on YouTube at Jade Vine. I guess you'll probably do a link or something in the description. I have a website linked there, and I do some writing and other stuff on there that isn't on the site. But yeah, come and I stream decently often on YouTube. So yeah, come have fun.
Thank you so much, Jade. Appreciate you.
Yep. Have a good one.